Hey guys, tonight we begin with how Soviet Union citizens survived Cold War hardships. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The Cold War was more than a clash between superpowers, more than speeches in the United Nations or missiles hidden in silos. For millions of ordinary Soviet citizens, it was something that shaped the rhythms of daily life. It was the sound of footsteps on icy pavement as women carried heavy shopping bags home. The endless standing in queues that seemed to coil around city blocks. And the feeling that every loaf of bread, every stick of butter, and every pair of shoes had its own story of scarcity. To live through the Cold War in the Soviet Union was not to exist in a blur of geopolitics, but to navigate a landscape of small struggles, improvisations, and compromises. Imagine it is the early 1950s. The Second World War has ended, leaving cities scarred with ruins and hearts heavy with grief. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, yet victory carried its own costs. Entire villages were razed, industry had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, and the population carried deep wounds. Families were missing fathers, sons, and brothers. Mothers and grandmothers shouldered the burden of raising children in cramped apartments, where plasters sometimes fell from the ceiling and heating pipes rattled like old bones. This was the backdrop against which Cold War hardships began. At first, survival meant reconstruction. Citizens were told they lived in a socialist paradise, a new society of workers and peasants united in strength. Propaganda posters showed smiling factory workers, muscular and proud, lifting tools under rays of sunshine while farmers reaped golden fields of wheat. Yet the reality was different. Bread was rationed. Meat appeared in shops sporadically, if at all. When it did, women and men rushed into queues, sometimes waiting for hours just to receive a few slices of sausage wrapped in crinkled paper. The government encouraged sacrifice, and people internalized it. They believed that enduring hardships was part of building socialism, a necessary price to pay for progress and for victory over the West. The rhythm of daily life revolved around scarcity. Kitchens were small, often shared among several families in cramped communal apartments called communalkas. In such places, neighbors might argue over the use of a single stove, or over who had taken someone else's bread ration from the cupboard. Privacy was rare. Conversations carried through thin walls, and gossip often traveled faster than truth. Yet, in these spaces, people also learned cooperation. They shared recipes for stretching limited supplies, trading a handful of buckwheat for a piece of fish, or exchanging one family's surplus cabbage for another's sugar. Children grew up accustomed to these struggles. For them, standing in line with their parents became part of the fabric of childhood. They would bring along their schoolwork to finish while waiting for potatoes or milk. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they were rewarded with a rare sweet maybe, a caramel candy, or a crumbly piece of halva. Scarcity was not merely endured, it shaped expectations, lowering the threshold of joy. A bar of chocolate could feel like a festival, and oranges at New Year's were treasured like jewels. The Cold War also demanded resilience in less obvious ways. Fear of war lingered. Citizens carried with them the memory of bombings, of hunger during the German invasion, of soldiers who never returned. The Soviet state constantly reminded people of external enemies, of the looming threat from the West. Radio broadcasts repeated warnings about spies, traitors, and capitalist plots. Newspapers printed stories of how America sought to undermine socialism. This atmosphere kept people on edge, yet it also bound them together. Ordinary Soviet citizens were reminded that they were not just enduring hardships for themselves, but for the survival of their nation. Workplaces, too, became arenas of Cold War life. Factories buzzed with the clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the hum of conveyor belts. Workers pushed themselves to meet impossible quotas, urged on by slogans painted in red across the walls. Labor is honor. Labor is strength. Managers held up Stakhanovite workers, those who exceeded production goals, as heroes of the socialist system. But behind these stories of triumph lay exhaustion. Men and women often returned home drained, collapsing into bed without energy, only to wake before dawn to repeat the cycle. Yet even here, resilience thrived. In workshops and offices, colleagues exchanged jokes, whispered frustrations, and shared stolen moments of laughter. Humor became a quiet rebellion against the grind. The Cold War also shaped how people saw the outside world. Foreign travel was rare, restricted to trusted individuals. Western goods were coveted, yet scarce, creating a peculiar blend of envy and suspicion. A neighbor with an imported radio or a pair of American jeans became both admired and resented. Some Soviet citizens tried to recreate foreign luxuries at home, sewing clothes in imitation of Western styles, or cooking dishes inspired by vague rumors of what Americans ate. Others leaned fully into Soviet pride, embracing the idea that their system was superior, even if their cupboards were bare. Evenings in Soviet cities carried a quiet rhythm. After long hours of work and queues, families gathered around the radio and later the television to hear speeches, news reports, and cultural programs. Entertainment was tightly controlled, but citizens found ways to make it meaningful. Theater and ballet flourished, offering both escape and pride. Literature was devoured, with works of Russian classics filling shelves in nearly every home. For many, books became companions in a world of scarcity, offering both solace and intellectual nourishment. Religion, too, lived on in quiet persistence. Officially discouraged, it often survived in whispers and traditions passed down at home. An old grandmother lighting a candle in secret, a child learning to cross himself before bed, a family baking Easter bread quietly. All of these small acts of faith became part of the tapestry of survival. In a system that demanded loyalty to the state, private rituals gave people another source of strength. The Cold War hardships were not only about scarcity of food or goods. They were about the weight of surveillance, the sense of being watched. Conversations were careful, words chosen with precision. A careless remark could be reported, turning into suspicion or worse. The knock on the door at night was feared, though not always common, and the shadow of political repression lingered. To survive meant to master the art of silence, to learn when to speak and when to stay quiet. This atmosphere seeped into daily life, shaping even small interactions with neighbors, colleagues, and friends. And yet, despite everything, there was warmth. Soviet citizens celebrated birthdays with gatherings where tables, though modest, were filled with homemade dishes, pickled vegetables, dumplings, and black bread. Vodka bottles were passed around, and toasts were made to health, to family, to the future. Music filled the rooms, sometimes from scratchy gramophones, sometimes from an accordion pulled out of a corner. Laughter rose, children played, and for a few hours, the weight of the Cold War lifted. These moments of joy, however fragile, were what sustained people as the years passed. Cold War life became an ongoing negotiation between deprivation and resilience. Citizens learned to patch clothes rather than buy new ones, to save every scrap of paper, to turn scarcity into ingenuity. They built furniture out of old crates, grew vegetables on tiny dacha plots outside the cities, and created recipes that stretched a single chicken into meals for an entire week. Women and men became masters of improvisation. In the end, what defined life under Cold War hardships was not only endurance, but creativity. Soviet citizens survived not simply by following orders, but by inventing their own ways to live within constraints. They found warmth in communal life, humor in hardship, and meaning in traditions. For them, survival was not just about getting through the day, but about holding on to dignity, identity, and humanity in a world shaped by scarcity and suspicion. As the 1950s deepened into the 1960s, the Cold War settled into the daily routines of Soviet citizens like a constant background hum. People were aware of missile crises, of nuclear tests in distant steppes, of speeches exchanged between leaders and their Western counterparts. Yet for the average person in Leningrad, Kiev, or a Siberian industrial town, these world-shaking events translated into far smaller, more personal adjustments. The Cold War was experienced not in the Kremlin, but in the kitchen, in the factory, and in the long corridors of communal apartments. The kitchen remained the stage upon which scarcity played its most familiar role. Soviet women, often expected to manage households even while holding full-time jobs, became masters of resourcefulness. They could take a sack of potatoes, a jar of pickles, and a few eggs and transform them into a week's worth of meals. Families ate stews that simmered for hours on small gas burners, stretching meager supplies into something filling. Cookbooks circulated that taught the art of substitution where meat could be replaced by mushrooms or butter by sunflower oil. In some homes, an air of triumph accompanied even the simplest dish. A steaming bowl of borscht was not merely food. It was proof that life could be coaxed into joy even within constraints. Food shortages bred not only ingenuity but also community. Queues often became places of social life. Women and men stood together for hours, and during those long waits, conversations blossomed. Neighbors exchanged gossip, advice, and recipes while inching forward, hoping the store would not run out before their turn. Friendships were formed in those queues, and sometimes alliances were built, agreements to hold a place in line for one another, or to trade goods afterward. The line itself became a shared ordeal, a symbol of patience and persistence that bound citizens together in the most ordinary of struggles. Outside the kitchen and the shops, the state loomed large. Propaganda posters appeared everywhere, bright reds and bold. Images of farmers and workers raising their fists toward the horizon. They promised abundance, yet citizens standing in empty shops could see the gap between promise and reality. Still, propaganda was not easily dismissed. It seeped into language, into rituals, into the stories children learned in school. Students memorized the achievements of Soviet scientists and the heroism of workers. Songs were taught that glorified labor, patriotism, and sacrifice. In classrooms adorned with portraits of Lenin, Children recited pledges of loyalty. The Cold War was not just external. It was internalized in the hearts and minds of the young. Despite shortages, the Soviet Union invested heavily in scientific progress and space exploration. When Yuri Gagarin soared into space in 1961, Soviet citizens erupted with pride. For a moment, scarcity and struggle seemed overshadowed by triumph. Families huddled around radios to hear the news, and the first human orbit of Earth became a shared victory. That night, in dimly lit apartments, people toasted with tea or vodka, proud that their country had reached the stars. Yet even in this moment of celebration, they returned the next day to the same long queues for bread. This duality triumph and scarcity-defined Cold War survival. Housing, too, was a constant struggle. The Soviet Union sought to provide apartments for its citizens, but demand always outstripped supply. Families were squeezed into communal flats, where 3 or 4 households shared one kitchen and one bathroom. Privacy was nearly impossible, and quarrels over cleanliness or noise were frequent. Still, there was also a strange intimacy in this forced proximity. Children played together in narrow hallways, borrowing each other's toys. Adults learned to ignore the sounds of arguments through thin walls. And when one family celebrated, neighbors were often invited, because joy, like scarcity, was better shared than endured alone. In rural villages, the hardships took a different shape. Agriculture was collectivized, and peasants worked under strict quotas. They had to deliver grain to the state, even when it meant keeping little for themselves. Many families supplemented their diets by cultivating small private plots of land, growing vegetables and raising chickens or goats. These plots became lifelines, providing food for the table and sometimes goods for barter. A single basket of tomatoes, exchanged discreetly with neighbors, could mean the difference between hunger and nourishment. In this way, survival often relied less on official systems and more on the quiet resilience of families carving out space for themselves. Daily life was also shaped by the presence of surveillance. The KGB's reputation was powerful enough that even those who had no direct contact with it lived under its shadow. Conversations in public places were measured. Families taught children not to repeat at school what they heard at home, for fear of attracting suspicion. A casual joke about a leader, spoken too loudly, could bring consequences. And yet, within trusted circles, humor flourished. Jokes about shortages, about the government, about the absurdities of daily life became a form of resistance. Telling such jokes was risky, but it was also cathartic. It was a way to claim agency, however small, in a world where so much was beyond control. Work remained central to identity. The state tied personal dignity to labor, presenting it as the foundation of the socialist dream. To be a good worker was to be a good citizen. Men and women reported to factories, offices, and farms, not only to earn wages, but also to fulfill ideological expectations. Yet beneath this surface lay fatigue. Machines broke down. Supplies ran short. Managers pressured employees to meet impossible targets. And workers often had to improvise with whatever materials were at hand. The ingenuity that kept homes functioning also kept factories alive. Survival in the workplace meant constant adaptation. Yet even as material life was difficult, Soviet citizens found meaning in culture. Theater, music, and literature flourished, providing both escape and pride. Families dressed in their best clothes to attend the ballet, sitting in grand halls that contrasted sharply with the drabness of daily life. Writers and poets, though censored, still spoke to the deeper truths of human endurance. Books were treasured possessions, passed hand to hand, read late into the night under dim lamps. A single volume of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky could accompany a person through years of scarcity, offering both moral guidance and solace. Seasons marked the rhythms of hardship and relief. Winters were harsh, with icy winds cutting through poorly insulated apartments. Families huddled around stoves, layering clothing to stay warm. Summers, on the other hand, brought respite in the form of decasmal country cottages where families could grow vegetables and breathe fresh air. The ritual of tending gardens, harvesting cucumbers, or boiling jars of preserves for winter storage was both practical and therapeutic. It gave families a sense of control, however modest, over their food supply and their future. Through all of this, resilience was not merely passive endurance. It was active, creative, and communal. Soviet citizens invented ways to make do, to find joy, and to maintain dignity. They celebrated holidays with whatever was available, decorating New Year's trees with homemade ornaments, preparing feasts from humble ingredients. They raised children to believe in a future brighter than the present, instilling in them both pride and patience. The Cold War was not just about missiles and spies. It was about the millions of small, daily negotiations that kept people alive and gave meaning to survival. Each loaf of bread won in a queue, each meal stretched from scraps, each joke whispered in secret was a quiet act of defiance against the weight of hardship. For Soviet citizens, survival was not only about enduring the cold, it was about living fully in spite of it. Even amid the weariness of shortages and the constant presence of the state, people found ways to carve out private worlds of meaning. In many families, evenings were spent around the table, not in abundance, but in togetherness. A samovar, puffing quietly with steam, became a centerpiece. Tea poured into glasses with metal holders passed from hand to hand. Bread, sometimes hard and stale, was softened with sugar or jam if it was available. Conversation meandered between politics, spoken in whispers, stories of childhood villages, and hopes for the next generation. These quiet evenings were survival in their own right, a reminder that identity and dignity could endure in the smallest rituals. In the cities, cultural institutions remained a vital lifeline. Cinemas offered escape, even if the films were often heavily censored or filled with propaganda. Young couples walked arm in arm into theaters to watch heroic tales of workers and soldiers. Yet behind the surface message, there was still joy in laughter, romance, and shared experience. Music, too, carried a double edge. Official songs blared from radios, praising collective labor or the strength of the motherland. But unscratched vinyl records, carefully passed from hand to hand, Western jazz and rock found their way into living rooms. To listen was risky, but to hear those rhythms was to glimpse a wider world, to taste freedom through melody. The young especially lived in this tension. Teenagers wore the clothes, available often drab, often uniform, but they found ways to alter them, to hint at individuality. A scarf worn differently, a belt styled to mimic Western fashion, a haircut inspired by a smuggled magazine photo. Each choice was subtle resistance, a statement that even within constraint, personality could not be erased. Schoolyards became places where ideas about the West circulated, traded as eagerly as chewing gum or cigarettes. The state tried to shape them into disciplined builders of socialism, but their laughter, their curiosity, their rebellion in small acts proved otherwise. In rural settings, the rhythm of life still beat closer to the land. Villagers endured harsh winters that locked them in snow, with sledges creaking down icy paths to deliver firewood or carry children to school. Women carried water from frozen wells, their hands cracked and raw. Men mended tools by candlelight, determined to make them last another season. And yet, when spring arrived, it was greeted with almost sacred relief. The thaw released rivers, fields opened again, and planting began. The cycles of survival were endless, and villagers carried them out with both weariness and pride. For them, survival was not merely about enduring the cold, it was about withstanding nature's trials alongside political ones. The Cold War also shaped how families understood security. Air raid drills became routine in schools and workplaces, with children instructed to duck under desks or march into basements at the sound of sirens. Posters reminded citizens of the need to remain vigilant against Western spies. Rumors of nuclear catastrophe traveled by word of mouth, never official but always present. For many, the threat was abstract, yet real enough to create anxiety. Still, life went on. People planted gardens, attended weddings, celebrated births. The paradox of survival was learning to live as if tomorrow might be ordinary, even when the world seemed to teeter on catastrophe. Healthcare, while officially free, bore its own hardships. Clinics were often understocked, with medicines in short supply and equipment outdated. Doctors did what they could with limited resources, relying on ingenuity and the goodwill of patients who sometimes brought small gifts, flowers, a cake, even a loaf of bread as tokens of gratitude. Folk remedies lingered, too. Grandmothers brewed herbal teas for colds, wrapped children in wool soaked with vinegar for fevers, or whispered prayers over the ill. Science and tradition intertwined in households where survival meant using whatever means were available. Yet, through all this, joy remained. Weddings were elaborate affairs, even if food was rationed. Families saved for months to prepare feasts, setting tables with whatever delicacies they could acquire. Guests danced late into the night, an accordion or gramophone providing music. Toasts were made not just to the bride and groom, but to endurance, to health, to the hope of better days. Funerals, too, brought communities together in mourning and remembrance. Life, in its milestones, was honored with as much dignity as citizens could muster, regardless of scarcity. For children, play was survival disguised as innocence. They crafted toys from scraps, sticks becoming swords, pebbles becoming treasures. In city courtyards, children played football with makeshift balls, their laughter echoing off grey apartment blocks. In villages, they splashed in rivers, climbed trees, and chased chickens. Parents watched with pride, even as they worried about the world these children would inherit. Childhood was a shield, however brief, against the heavier burdens of Cold War life. Amid these struggles, there was always the sense of duality. Life was both heavy with hardship and yet filled with moments of grace. Citizens endured surveillance, shortages, and propaganda. Yet they also carved out lives filled with laughter, love, and resilience. The Cold War may have been fought in the language of politics and ideology, but for those living inside the Soviet Union, it was survived in the kitchen, the garden, the queue, and the quiet conversations whispered between friends. This balance between burden and endurance, despair and joy defined the daily reality of Soviet citizens. They carried on, not because conditions were easy, but because to give up was unthinkable. Life demanded persistence, and so they persisted. Each morning brought new challenges, and each evening brought small victories, a warm meal, a shared story, the sight of children sleeping safely in crowded apartments. In those moments, survival became not only possible but meaningful. Winter always reminded Soviet citizens of their own fragility. The snow was not simply weather. It was an adversary. Temperatures plunged so low that metal froze to the touch. Windows frosted over from the inside, and footsteps crackled like breaking glass on the streets. City dwellers layered themselves with heavy coats, fur hats, and boots with cardboard tucked inside to patch worn soles. In villages, stoves were fed constantly with wood or coal. The smoke curling from chimneys, a signal that life inside still fought against the cold. Pipes burst, electricity faltered, and yet each family found a way to survive another season. Survival was not just about politics. It was a daily battle against nature itself. Inside the cramped apartments, warmth was shared as much through closeness as through radiators. Families huddled in one room, sleeping in thick layers of clothing beneath heavy blankets. Windows were stuffed with cloth to keep out the drafts. Meals were hearty and practical. Cabbage soup, potatoes, buckwheat, bread. When meat was scarce, creativity replaced it mushrooms, pickled vegetables, and whatever could be foraged or traded. These humble meals carried immense symbolic weight, proof that resourcefulness could transform scarcity into sustenance. While the Cold War was a backdrop of looming danger, life in the Soviet Union was also about routine. People woke early, boarded overcrowded trams or buses, and trudged to workplaces where efficiency was demanded, yet resources were lacking. Machines broke, supplies ran out, but the work went on. There was pride in endurance engineers solving problems with spare parts, teachers instructing with outdated books, farmers coaxing crops from stubborn soil. The propaganda posters proclaimed the glory of labor, but for most citizens, it was not glory they sought. It was the simple satisfaction of getting through another day, providing for their families, and maintaining dignity in the process. Evenings often carried a quieter rhythm. After a day of queues and work, people retreated into domestic rituals. Women mended clothes, patching worn sleeves so garments could last another year. Men tinkered with radios, adjusting dials to catch faint signals from the west, straining to hear voices that spoke of another world. Children did their homework at kitchen tables, their pencils scratching on paper as mothers hovered with both pride and worry. These were not grand moments, but they were lifelines. Moments of stability amid uncertainty. Religion, though officially discouraged, remained a thread of strength. Churches stood as symbols of tradition and resilience, their bells sometimes muffled but never silenced. Families slipped quietly into services, candles flickering against icons, whispers of prayer mingling with incense. Faith gave meaning when politics felt overwhelming. It gave hope when survival felt like drudgery. Even when the state discouraged belief, the soul found its own sanctuary. Entertainment, too, was sought in the most modest of forms. A radio comedy, a neighbor's guitar, or a book shared between friends. Libraries were filled with works approved by the state. But even within those pages, people found imagination, escape, and sometimes subtle critiques hidden in allegory. The act of reading itself became defiance proof that the mind could not be fully controlled. Stories carried citizens far from their small apartments, beyond the queues, beyond the Cold War itself. If only for an evening, the youth of the Soviet Union lived with both fear and boundless curiosity. They learned to march in parades, to salute flags, to recite slogans. Yet in secret, they also dreamed. Some dreamed of careers as scientists, athletes, or artists. Others dreamed of a life beyond borders, a life they pieced together from contraband magazines or faint radio broadcasts. Their survival was not only about enduring the present, but about envisioning futures that felt almost impossible. They wrote poems, scribbled songs, sketched ideas that broke boundaries. Their creativity was as vital as food or heat. It was fuel for the spirit. Friendship became one of the most important means of survival. Bonds between neighbors, co-workers, and classmates provided solidarity when shortages struck or when state pressures grew heavy. A borrowed cup of sugar, a shared loaf of bread, a sympathetic ear. These small exchanges built invisible networks of resilience. People learned to trust carefully, but when trust was earned, it was deep and unshakable. In a world where official narratives loomed large, the quiet truth passed between friends mattered more. The Cold War also meant living with contradiction. Citizens were told daily that they lived in the most advanced, powerful system on Earth. Yet when they opened their cupboards, they often found emptiness. They were told they were free, yet they censored their own conversations for fear of who might be listening. They were told to celebrate progress, even as elevators broke and stores ran dry. To survive was to carry these contradictions without letting them consume hope. Humor became a weapon. Jokes about the shortages, about the leaders, about the absurdity of daily life circulated quietly. Laughter, even whispered, was survival. And so, Soviet citizens continued. They endured winters, shortages, propaganda, and fear. But they also built families, created art, celebrated milestones, and found joy in resilience. The Cold War was waged on political stages, but for ordinary people, it was survived in kitchens, in crowded trams, in snowy courtyards, and in quiet acts of persistence. Each day they carried forward, step by step, holding onto fragments of humanity that could not be erased by scarcity or state. The story of survival in the Soviet Union is not simply one of hardship, it is one of endurance, of dignity in small things, and of the power of ordinary people to withstand extraordinary pressures. It is a story of how life continued, not in spite of the Cold War, but within it. When we turn from the rhythms of daily life to the broader structures that framed them, we find the machinery of the state pressing upon every corner of existence. The Soviet Union was not simply a collection of cities, factories, and villages. It was a living system of rules, surveillance, and ideology. To survive within it, citizens developed an instinct for caution, for reading between lines, and for navigating both spoken and unspoken expectations. Propaganda was omnipresent. It lived on billboards that towered above muddy streets, on posters pasted to crumbling walls, and in the red banners that unfurled across factories during holidays. Loudspeakers crackled with speeches extolling the triumph of socialism, the victory of labor, the inevitability of communism's global spread. For the state, these were tools of control. For the people, they were background noise, endured rather than believed. Citizens grew skilled at nodding at the right times, repeating slogans when necessary, and then retreating into private thoughts where skepticism quietly bloomed. The education system reinforced these ideals from the earliest years. Children learned about Lenin as though he were a saint, reciting his words as sacred truths. Textbooks described the West not as a place of opportunity, but as a failing, decadent world of greed and inequality. Classrooms were decorated with portraits of party leaders, their stern gazes following students as they solved equations or memorized poems. Yet, Amid this indoctrination, teachers often taught more than they were supposed to. A wink, a carefully chosen novel, or a whispered aside could open a window into a wider world. Survival, for both students and teachers, meant balancing obedience with curiosity. The workplace, too, was both a source of stability and frustration. The Soviet Union guaranteed employment, and for many this offered a sense of security unknown in capitalist systems. But this security came at a cost. Factories often lacked the raw materials needed to produce their quotas. Machines broke down regularly, and managers scrambled to make numbers look good on paper, even when reality fell short. Citizens joked that they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work, a grim acknowledgement of inefficiency. Yet beneath the sarcasm lay resilience. Workers became experts in improvisation, fixing equipment with wire, reusing old parts, and finding creative solutions when the state failed to provide. Queues were another defining feature of Soviet survival. To outsiders, a line of people stretching around the block might seem like an inconvenience. To citizens, it was a way of life. They queued for bread, for meat, for shoes, for winter coats, even for toilet paper. A rumor of a delivery could send a neighborhood rushing to the nearest shop. People held places in line for friends or neighbors, creating a complex choreography of patience and solidarity. Standing in line was exhausting, but it was also social. Stories were exchanged, jokes were told, and sometimes friendships were forged. To endure the shortages, people leaned on one another, finding community even in frustration at the same time. The ever-present gaze of the state forced citizens to watch their words carefully. The KGB's reach was not total, but the possibility that someone might be listening was enough to shape behavior. Conversations in kitchens were whispered, radios from the West were played softly, and letters were written cautiously. Trust was precious, given sparingly, and often reserved only for family or the closest friends. Yet even under these conditions, people found ways to speak truth. They invented coded language, subtle humor, and careful hints. Survival depended on this delicate balance to remain safe, while still retaining one's voice. Leisure offered another realm of quiet resistance. Citizens skated on frozen ponds, hiked in the forests, and swam in rivers during brief summers. The natural world became an escape from the pressures of politics. Outdoors, beyond the slogans and walls, people could breathe more freely. Fishing trips, berry-picking expeditions, and long walks through birch groves reminded them of older rhythms of life, rhythms untouched by ideology. In nature, survival felt less like endurance and more like continuity with the past. Festivals and celebrations, though shaped by the state, also gave people joy. May Day parades filled streets with flags and music, children dressed in uniforms, workers carrying signs of solidarity. These events reinforced official narratives, but they were also moments of genuine festivity. Families dressed in their best clothes, children clutched balloons, and the city came alive with color. Even when politics dictated the theme, people embraced the chance to celebrate life itself. For many, survival during the Cold War meant learning to live within contradictions. They lived in a system that promised abundance but delivered scarcity, that preached freedom while demanding conformity, that celebrated progress while ignoring decay. To reconcile these contradictions, citizens became masters of compartmentalization. Outwardly, they played their roles, marching, applauding, saluting. Inwardly, they nurtured private hopes, quiet truths, and small joys that could not be legislated away. In these ways, Soviet citizens did not simply endure Cold War hardships, they adapted. They created parallel worlds within their kitchens, their friendships, and their imaginations. These worlds, fragile but essential, sustained them through decades of tension, scarcity, and surveillance. They remind us that survival is not only about enduring deprivation, but about preserving humanity against the weight of ideology. The Cold War was not only fought with weapons and armies, but also with stories, with images, with competing visions of how life should be lived. Soviet citizens were constantly reminded that they lived in the workers' paradise, while capitalist societies were portrayed as corrupt and unstable. Yet in the quiet of their homes, many people sought out glimpses of the outside world, searching for cracks in the narrative that surrounded them. Western radio stations became windows into that other reality. Voices from the BBC, Voice of America, or Radio Free Europe floated across static-filled airwaves, bringing forbidden news and foreign music. Families would gather around a radio late at night, the volume turned low, curtains drawn, the room hushed. To listen was to risk suspicion, but the allure was strong. Jazz, rock and roll, or even Western pop songs carried more than rhythm, they carried the scent of another life, one beyond shortages and restrictions. Citizens often remembered the thrill of those nights, the mix of fear and excitement, the sense of touching something both dangerous and liberating. Books carried a similar power. Official literature celebrated Soviet heroes, factory workers, and patriotic sacrifice. But beneath the radar, semi-legal, self-published works circulated hand to hand. These could be political critiques, banned novels, or even translations of Western writers. Each copied page was a risk, each shared volume a small act of defiance. For those lucky enough to hold such a book, the experience was electric. The words on the page carried more weight precisely because they were forbidden. To read was not just to learn, it was to resist. Even fashion, seemingly mundane, became a quiet battleground of survival and identity. Official Soviet clothing was often drab and uniform, practical rather than expressive. Yet young people found ways to alter, embellish, or repurpose their wardrobes. Some stitched brighter fabrics into collars, others smuggled Western jeans or records. To wear Levi's was to declare, silently but unmistakably, an alignment with a world beyond the Iron Curtain. Each thread of denim became a symbol of individuality in a society that demanded conformity. Food, always scarce, shaped ingenuity in daily life. Housewives learned how to stretch ingredients, making soups from bones, salads from pickled vegetables, desserts from crumbs of chocolate. Recipes were traded like precious secrets, each one a testament to resilience. Families celebrated meals not for their abundance, but for the creativity and care that went into them. A loaf of bread shared with laughter was worth more than a feast filled with suspicion. Markets and black markets alike became arenas where survival meant knowing how to bargain, when to trade, and whom to trust. Religion, though suppressed, never fully disappeared. Churches stood, often repurposed or neglected, but belief lingered in whispered prayers and private rituals. Baptisms were carried out discreetly, icons were hidden in cupboards, and grandmothers whispered blessings over children before bed. For many, faith was not merely spiritual, it was another form of survival, a way of holding on to identity in the face of a state that sought to erase it. In moments of despair, these traditions offered comfort, grounding people in something older and deeper than ideology. one cannot speak of Soviet survival without acknowledging the role of humor. Jokes and anecdotes circulated widely, sharp and fearless. They mocked shortages, bureaucracy, and even the highest leaders. Everyone knew the risk of repeating them publicly, but within trusted circles, laughter became a shield. To laugh at power was to claim a measure of freedom. A simple joke, told in a cramped kitchen over tea, could light up an entire evening. These jokes, passed along like contraband, reminded citizens that they were not alone in their frustrations. The hardships of the Cold War were not equally shared. Life in Moscow or Leningrad, while difficult, was still far more privileged than life in remote villages or industrial towns. In rural areas, shortages were sharper, options fewer. Yet even there, survival meant reliance on networks of kinship and barter. Villagers grew food, raised animals, and leaned on centuries-old traditions of sharing and reciprocity. Despite propaganda's insistence on modernization, many rural families survived precisely because they held on to old practices that the state considered outdated. Children grew up amid these contradictions, learning early how to navigate them. They recited slogans at school, but at home, they heard their parents' quiet frustrations. They watched parades with excitement, yet also noticed the weary expressions of adults. Childhood toys were often simple, homemade, or recycled, but imagination filled the gaps. A stick became a sword, a scarf became a cape. In a society where material abundance was rare, creativity was abundant. These children, shaped by scarcity, grew into adults skilled at making do, at bending without breaking. The Cold War era demanded resilience, not just from individuals, but from entire families. Survival was a collective project. Parents shielded children from political dangers. Children carried household responsibilities, and grandparents often provided wisdom or stories of survival from earlier wars and famines. The memory of suffering in World War II lingered like a shadow, teaching families that hardship could be endured. That memory, painful but instructive, strengthened their ability to face the challenges of the Cold War. When viewed from afar, life in the Soviet Union during these years can seem grey and oppressive, and in many ways it was. But to stop there is to miss the full picture. For within the cracks of that system, there was colour, warmth, and life. Citizens carved out spaces of joy, resistance, and hope. They learned to play roles when necessary, but behind those masks, they remained profoundly human. This dual existence, the public and the private, the official and the personal, defined survival. To live through the Cold War as a Soviet citizen was to carry two truths at once: the truth of the slogans and parades, and the truth of the whispered conversations and quiet dreams. It was to endure hardship, yes, but also to prove, again and again, that survival is as much about spirit as it is about necessity. For many Soviet citizens, survival during the Cold War was not simply about food or clothing, but about enduring the grinding machinery of the state itself. Bureaucracy was everywhere, towering and faceless. To secure even the smallest of necessities, apartment, a medical appointment, or the right to travel between cities required, navigating endless corridors of paperwork, waiting in queues, and encountering officials whose power could make or break lives with a single stamp. Yet within this system, people became skilled navigators. They learned which offices to visit, which clerks were sympathetic, and how to use favors or small gifts to open doors that would otherwise remain firmly closed. The word black connections, influence, was more valuable than currency. A person with the right contacts could secure medicine or access to education, while someone without connections might struggle indefinitely. Survival meant cultivating relationships, weaving oneself into networks of reciprocity that softened the hard edges of officialdom. That housing was another constant challenge. The Soviet dream of communal living was intended to foster unity and equality, but in reality, it often led to crowded apartments where multiple families shared kitchens, bathrooms, and thin walls. Privacy was a rare luxury. Conversations had to be measured, as even a careless word could be overheard and repeated. Yet within these cramped quarters, people built lives. Kitchens became gathering spaces, their small tables crowded with tea, glasses, and bread. In these kitchens, true conversations happened about politics, fears, hopes, and dreams. The kitchen table became a sacred space of honesty in a society where the public sphere demanded caution. The intimacy of these conversations bound families and friends together, creating micro-worlds of trust in an atmosphere of suspicion. Education was both a weapon of the state and a ladder of survival for its citizens. Schools emphasized patriotism, discipline, and loyalty to the party, drilling children in history shaped to glorify the Soviet system. Yet education also offered opportunities. A child who excelled in mathematics, science, or engineering could rise beyond their humble beginnings, gaining access to universities and careers that might improve their family's standing. Parents understood this and invested deeply in their children's schooling, even if it meant long hours of homework after days spent queuing for food. Teachers, too, navigated their dual roles, publicly reinforcing party doctrine while quietly encouraging intellectual curiosity where they could. For some students, the classroom became a place where they glimpsed the wider world through literature, science experiments, or even the distant dream of space travel. Indeed, the space race itself was both a burden and a beacon. While Soviet citizens endured shortages at home, they also watched their nation launch Sputnik and send Yuri Gagarin into orbit. These achievements filled many with pride, a reminder that despite the grayness of daily life, their country was capable of astonishing feats. Parents told their children about the cosmonauts with pride, even as they patched clothes or made soup from scraps. The paradox was striking. A nation that could touch the stars, yet struggled to provide enough bread. Still, for ordinary people, the triumphs of space exploration were more than propaganda. There were glimpses of possibility, a rare source of collective joy amid hardship. At the same time, the constant presence of surveillance shaped every interaction. The KGB's shadow stretched across cities and villages alike. People never knew who might be listening, who might report an unguarded comment, or who might be silently watching. Fear was not always spoken, but it was deeply felt. Yet this fear also sharpened the art of subtlety. Citizens mastered the skill of speaking in hints, of using coded language, of conveying truth without ever naming it outright. This way of communicating, though exhausting, also created bonds of trust. To speak freely with another was to place immense confidence in them. And that confidence, when honored, built friendships stronger than steel. Religion, as before, persisted quietly despite repression. Priests baptized children in secret, and families passed down faith in whispers. For many, the rituals of belief, lighting a candle, making the sign of the cross, saying a prayer before sleep, were acts of quiet resistance. In a world dominated by ideology, these gestures reminded people of a different order of truth. Religion was not only spiritual, but also cultural, a link to ancestors, to traditions older than the Soviet state. Each hidden icon, each hushed hymn, was a survival strategy as much as a devotion. Leisure, too, carried its contradictions. Official cultural life was filled with parades, festivals, and performances designed to display unity and strength. Citizens marched with flags, watched patriotic films, and applauded at concerts glorifying the state. But beneath this facade, people found ways to enjoy themselves in more personal ways. Families picnicked in forests, children played soccer in muddy fields, and young couples walked hand in hand by rivers. Music, whether classical, folk, or smuggled Western rock, provided escape and expression. Dancing in crowded apartments to a scratchy record. People found joy that the state could not regulate. The rhythm of survival often came down to seasons. Winters were brutal, stretching resources to their limit. Heating systems failed, boots wore thin, and food supplies dwindled. Families huddled together under blankets, conserving warmth. Yet summer brought relief. Long days of sun, markets with fresh produce, and the chance to spend time outdoors. Summer de chasse, small countryside plots were vital lifelines. Families grew potatoes, cucumbers, and tomatoes, preserving what they could for the winter ahead. These gardens, humble though they were, represented autonomy. To grow one's own food was to gain a measure of independence from the unreliable state system. The collective memory of war, famine, and hardship provided an underlying resilience. Nearly every family carried scars from World War II, the great patriotic war weather in the form of lost loved ones, ruined homes, or childhoods spent in hunger. Those memories were not distant history, but living experience, shaping how people faced new hardships. They knew suffering could be survived, and that knowledge itself was a resource. To endure the Cold War was not to confront something entirely new, but to draw upon a long history of endurance. And yet, for all the resilience, weariness was never far. Citizens carried their burdens quietly, their frustrations often expressed only in private. Yet the very act of continuing of raising children, of sharing meals, of laughing at jokes, of singing songs, was itself a form of victory. To survive was to defy the system's weight. Each small act of living fully, even under constraint, was a statement that the human spirit could not be entirely subdued by the middle years of the Cold War. Soviet citizens had perfected this art of dual existence. They lived outwardly as loyal citizens, marching in parades and mouthing slogans. But inwardly, they held on to their own truths, their own joys, their own hopes. Survival was not passive, was active, clever, and courageous. It required navigating shortages, enduring repression, and yet still finding ways to laugh, to love, and to dream. By the time the Cold War had settled into its long, uneasy rhythm, Soviet citizens were already seasoned veterans of survival. The years of Stalin's purges, the war with Nazi Germany, and the famines of the 1930s had built in people a thick skin, a kind of instinct for endurance. Still, the Cold War brought its own unique struggles, and survival required constant adaptation. Each day was a balancing act between navigating the official demands of the state and carving out a private world of humanity and hope. One of the greatest challenges remained the scarcity of consumer goods. Shops displayed rows of identical products, often poorly made, and the queues seemed never-ending. A simple trip to buy shoes might mean hours of waiting, only to find the right size unavailable. People learned to improvise, repairing old items, passing clothing down through generations, or exchanging goods through informal networks. A child might wear boots stuffed with newspaper to keep out the cold, while parents quietly traded homemade pickles or knitted scarves for something more essential. These small economies, based not on money but on barter and trust, became parallel lifelines to the official system. Food shortages, too, demanded ingenuity. Housewives became masters of stretching ingredients, finding ways to make meals from whatever was available. A pot of soup could be thinned to last another day, bread carefully rationed so that children would never go without. Preserving food in jars, smoking fish, and drying mushrooms were not hobbies but necessities. When sugar was scarce, sweeteners were improvised. When meat was unavailable, meals leaned on grains and root vegetables. The act of cooking itself became a form of resistance, a quiet assertion of life's continuity against the backdrop of scarcity. Children grew up absorbing this culture of improvisation. Toys were handmade, often carved from wood or stitched from scraps. Games required little more than imagination and the streets outside. Kites made from newspaper, balls sewn from rags, sleds hammered together from planks of wood. These humble creations carried joy far greater than their simple materials. For children, survival did not feel like survival. It felt like life filled with laughter and play, even within the grayness of the system. Parents, for their part, carried the heavy knowledge that such joys existed only because they worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that their families had just enough. Daily work life, too, carried its burdens. Factories were the backbone of Soviet production, and workers endured long hours in often harsh conditions. Machinery was outdated, safety was secondary, and quotas loomed large. To fall short of production goals could mean reprimand or worse. Yet within these factories, camaraderie grew. Workers shared cigarettes, swapped jokes, and helped each other meet impossible deadlines. The solidarity among workers was not simply about productivity. It was about survival. Together they endured, and together they found small victories in meeting a quota or fixing a broken machine with limited resources. The life of professionals, doctors, teachers, engineers, was no less demanding. A doctor might face shortages of medicine, improvising treatments with whatever was available. A teacher might be required to repeat party lines, yet quietly nurtured curiosity and creativity in their students. Engineers designed ambitious projects with limited materials, often solving problems in inventive ways. In each case, survival was not about rejecting the system outright, but about bending it, reshaping it, and filling its gaps with ingenuity. Cultural life offered both escape and constraint. The state promoted works that reinforced ideology, patriotic films, plays that glorified workers, novels that praised the party, but people hungered for more. They passed around samizdat typewritten copies of forbidden books, risking punishment for the chance to read a banned poem or novel. These underground networks of literature kept alive a sense of intellectual freedom. Even music carried this duality. Official songs filled the radio waves, but hidden within apartments. Records of Western jazz or rock played quietly, a private rebellion through rhythm and melody. For many young people, the forbidden notes of the Beatles or Elvis Presley were intoxicating reminders that another world existed beyond the Iron Curtain. Love and relationships, too, took on a particular texture in the Soviet Union. Weddings were modest, with limited supplies for celebration, yet families found ways to make them joyous. A single bottle of champagne might be shared by many, toasts lifted high despite the scarcity. Love itself was a refuge, Couples carved out private moments in a society that constantly demanded collective life. To hold hands, to whisper dreams in the quiet of a park, to dance in a small apartment, living room. These gestures became anchors against the uncertainty outside. Children born into such unions were raised in environments where parents' love, though strained by external hardships, remained fiercely protective. The omnipresence of propaganda was impossible to ignore. Portraits of leaders gazed down from walls. Slogans painted on factories proclaimed loyalty, and radio broadcasts repeated the state's triumphs. Yet citizens developed a kind of double vision. Outwardly, they nodded and repeated the lines, but inwardly, they often rolled their eyes or exchanged knowing glances. Humor became a survival mechanism. Sharp, witty jokes about leaders or shortages circulated quietly, known as anecdotes. These jokes, though small, released pressure, allowing people to laugh at the absurdities of daily life. A shared laugh in a kitchen, whispered so as not to be overheard, was as essential as bread. Travel was another domain shaped by both limitation and creativity. Foreign travel was reserved for the privileged few, usually party officials or carefully selected representatives. For ordinary citizens, journeys meant trains to other Soviet cities or, for the lucky, visits to the Black Sea coast. Train travel itself was a cultural experience, packed compartments, endless tea brewed in glass holders, strangers sharing food and stories as the landscape rolled past. These journeys, though modest, provided cherished memories. They were escapes, however brief, from the sameness of daily life. At the heart of all survival strategies was community. Neighbors borrowed flour, watched each other's children, and shared news of where to find scarce goods. Elderly grandmothers offered wisdom from harsher times. Their stories remind us that survival was possible because it had been done before. These intergenerational bonds kept families strong. In villages, the sense of community was even more pronounced. People shared tools, exchanged harvests, and relied on one another in ways city dwellers could not. The hardships of rural life were immense, yet the bonds forged in such environments were unbreakable. As the Cold War dragged on, resilience became routine. People no longer expected abundance or ease. Instead, they measured success in smaller, more intimate victories. A jar of jam preserved through the winter, a child excelling in school, a rare evening of music and laughter with friends. These were the milestones of survival. Life was not grand, but it was lived, and within it, citizens carved spaces of dignity and humanity. This was the paradox of Cold War survival in the Soviet Union. Citizens were hemmed in by shortages, surveillance, and propaganda, yet they managed to endure with creativity, solidarity, and quiet acts of defiance. Their survival was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and often courageous. They lived not just in spite of hardship, but against it, affirming every day that the human spirit was stronger than the cold machinery of ideology. By the 1960s, life inside the Soviet Union had entered a strange stage of both stability and stagnation. Stalin was gone, replaced by Khrushchev, whose promises of reform and abundance sparked cautious hope. For a brief time, citizens whispered about the possibility of a thaw, a softening of the iron grip that had defined their lives. Yet, as the Cold War deepened and the ideological struggle with the West intensified, many of those hopes shrank back into the background. Survival, once again, was less about dreaming of change and more about learning to navigate the daily grind. The Cold War wasn't only fought with missiles or speeches. It seeped into people's kitchens, schools, and offices, At home, families listened to radio broadcasts about American consumer plenty and Soviet scientific triumphs. On the one hand, Sputnik orbiting the Earth filled people with pride. On the other, shortages of butter and soap brought them back down to Earth. This tension between the grandeur of the Soviet state and the small humiliations of everyday life defined much of the Cold War experience for ordinary citizens. Food remained central to survival, but the character of shortages shifted. Official campaigns promised abundance corn, fields stretching endlessly, new agricultural methods solving hunger. In practice, the results were uneven. A mother might leave work early to stand in line for hours in front of a store rumored to have oranges. By the time she reached the counter, they might already be gone. Yet, when she returned home with nothing, her children still expected dinner. So she adapted, transforming potatoes into countless variations: boiled, fried, mashed, baked. Potatoes weren't simply food, they were survival incarnate. In rural areas, the story was both harsher and freer. Collective farms, controlled production, but many families relied on small private plots to survive. From these gardens came carrots, cabbages, cucumbers, and chickens. Rural children grew up chasing pigs, learning to milk cows, and gathering berries in nearby forests. The state took its share, often the lion's share, but what remained fed families through harsh winters. Survival here meant bending rules, hiding extra eggs from inspectors, or quietly selling produce at local markets. The countryside remained a backbone of survival, and city relatives often relied on packages of food sent by village kin. Meanwhile, the presence of the Cold War was felt even in children's education. School textbooks declared that capitalism bred greed and decay, while socialism represented equality and progress. Classrooms were decorated with portraits of Lenin, and children learned patriotic songs by heart. Yet beneath this ideology, teachers were also guardians of resilience. They encouraged young minds to read, to imagine, to explore mathematics and science. Some students secretly discovered Pushkin's forbidden verses or hidden translations of Western novels tucked into libraries. Learning itself became a double-edged survival tactic, absorbing what was required for safety while seeking out what nourished the soul. Workplace survival continued to demand creativity. In factories, outdated machinery often broke down, leaving workers scrambling to meet production targets. Spare parts were scarce, so improvisation became an art. A mechanic might repurpose a spring from an old machine to fix a new one, or weld tools together from scraps. Success wasn't only measured in fulfilling the state's plan. It was in keeping production alive against all odds. This skill of making do wasn't celebrated in speeches, but it was quietly honored among workers who knew that without such ingenuity, entire factories would grind to a halt. Offices and bureaucracies had their own struggles. Endless paperwork, rubber-stamped approvals, and layers of red tape meant even simple tasks dragged on. Citizens often learned which officials could be bribed with cigarettes, chocolate, or homemade vodka. These small transactions lubricated the gears of daily life, turning impossible barriers into manageable obstacles. In this way, survival was not always heroic or noble. Sometimes it was pragmatic, shaped by quiet negotiations and discreet exchanges. Beyond the tangible, survival in the Soviet Union during the Cold War was also psychological. Citizens learned the art of silence. At work, people avoided saying too much about their private lives. On buses or in queues, conversations steered toward safe topics. In kitchens, Behind closed doors, families spoke more freely, but even there, voices dropped when discussing sensitive subjects. Children were taught early, never repeat at school what you hear at home. This self-censorship was survival, a shield against the unpredictable consequences of words. Still, despite the constant vigilance, humor flourished. Jokes about leaders and shortages circulated like secret passwords. A man might lean close to his friend and mutter, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." The punchline earned not just laughter, but relief. These moments of humor reminded people that they were not alone in their struggles, that everyone saw the absurdity of the system. Even if no one dared say it out loud, love, family, and human connection also remained lifelines. Courtship rituals continued despite shortages and hardships. Young men wooed women with modest gifts, flowers, chocolates, or even just their time and loyalty. Weddings might lack luxury, but they overflowed with sincerity. Families pooled resources to create feasts out of whatever they could gather. Music played from borrowed records, couples danced in cramped apartments, and photographs captured smiles that seemed to defy the grayness outside. The birth of a child was always a victory, celebrated even if baby clothes had to be sewn from recycled fabric. Religion, though officially suppressed, quietly survived in many households. Churches remained open in some places, though attendance was monitored. For many, faith was practiced privately, in whispered prayers or icons hidden behind cupboard doors. This quiet spirituality offered comfort, reminding believers that survival had meaning beyond the immediate hardships of life, even for those who did not practice religion. Rituals of memory celebrating ancestors, remembering loved ones lost in wars and famines provided grounding in a world that often felt unstable. Leisure, too, was adapted to survival. With limited entertainment options, people made their own. Families gathered around radios, listening to music or serialized stories. Friends crowded into apartments for evenings of conversation, tea, and laughter. Summers brought vacations to dochas, where gardening mixed with relaxation. Swimming in rivers, roasting potatoes over open fires, and picking wildflowers became simple joys, creating memories that sustained people during bleak winters. Even small victories, finding a foreign chocolate bar, acquiring a new record, watching a Western film secretly screened, were treasured as glimpses into another life. Through all this, Soviet citizens became masters of endurance. Their strategies were rarely glamorous and often invisible. They did not overthrow the hardships, but rather absorbed them, bent them, and softened their edges. Their survival was built on millions of small acts. The grandmother quietly slipping an extra piece of bread to her grandchild. The father repairing shoes for the 10th time. The mother stretching a meal to feed one more. Each act, insignificant alone, combined to form a collective resilience that carried a society through decades of Cold War uncertainty. This resilience was not blind loyalty, nor was it outright rebellion. It was something in between, a quiet determination to live fully, even when the system demanded obedience. Citizens carved out private lives within public constraints, finding laughter in hardship, dignity in scarcity, and meaning in endurance. In this way, the story of Cold War survival in the Soviet Union was not simply about the endurance of a state, but the endurance of its people, whose human spirit remained unbroken despite the weight of history pressing down on them. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the Soviet Union entered what historians later called the the era of stagnation. Brezhnev, with his heavy eyebrows and calm voice, symbolized stability, but that stability often came at the cost of progress. For many citizens, this period was not defined by grand political speeches or military parades, but by the rhythm of daily survival in a system that provided just enough to live, but rarely enough to thrive. Queues remained a permanent feature of Soviet life. People joked that if they saw a line, they would stand in it first and ask questions later. Perhaps the shop had sugar, or boots, or even washing powder. Whatever it was worth waiting for. Entire days were consumed by this ritual. A young mother might wrap her child in a thick scarf and stand outside a shop for hours in the bitter cold, hoping to bring home something rare. The line itself became a community. Strangers shared gossip, whispered political jokes, and exchanged tips about where other goods might be found. Yet there was always a nervous undercurrent fear that after all that waiting, the shelves would be bare when their turn came. For those lucky enough to get their hands on goods, another challenge arose: how to make them last. Shoes were repaired again and again, soles patched with rubber from bicycle tires, leather stitched by hand. Clothing was mended, recycled, or passed down through generations. A child might wear a sweater that had belonged to an older cousin, then later be refashioned into mittens by a grandmother with a sewing machine older than the Soviet state itself. Nothing went to waste, not even the tiniest scraps of fabric. These acts of thrift were more than practical. They were creative, a quiet rebellion against scarcity in the workplace. Survival meant balancing official duties with unofficial ones. Many workers perfected the art of appearing busy when in fact they were conserving energy or even doing private tasks. A machinist might carve toys for his children while standing at his station. An office clerk might type a neighbor's wedding invitations using the state's typewriter. This blending of personal and collective blurred the lines between public life and private survival, while the government measured productivity with charts and quotas. Individuals measured it in whether their families had enough to eat and where. The black market grew in importance. During these years, it wasn't an organized underground empire, but rather a web of small favors, exchanges, and quiet deals. A worker in a food warehouse might save aside a bag of flour for a friend. In exchange, that friend's cousin, a mechanic, might repair his motorcycle. Cigarettes, vodka, and coffee became currencies as valuable as rubles, perhaps even more. Everyone knew it was illegal, but everyone also knew it was essential. The official economy could not meet people's needs, so the unofficial economy filled the gaps. Entertainment under Brezhnev reflected both the restrictions and the creativity of the times. Television was becoming more widespread, with shows carefully monitored for ideological purity. Citizens watched films that praised Soviet achievements or historical dramas that glorified Russia's past. Yet, alongside these official offerings, people found ways to access Western music and cinema. Vinyl records smuggled into the country were copied onto discarded X-ray films, literally pressed into the images of broken bones. These music on the ribs discs crackled with forbidden jazz and rock and roll. For teenagers, hearing the Beatles or the Rolling Stones was more than entertainment. It was a glimpse into another world, a world that seemed freer, brighter, and more exciting. Even state-approved culture carried its comforts. Poetry readings, theatrical performances, and Soviet pop music brought joy to millions. A theater ticket was a treasure, often requiring connections or luck. Inside dimly lit auditoriums, citizens found escape in the words of actors, the rhythm of ballet dancers, or the sweep of orchestral music. For a few hours, the hardships of daily life faded into the background. Art, even when wrapped in ideology, provided nourishment for the soul. Education during this era was rigorous and disciplined. Soviet schools emphasized mathematics, science, and engineering, preparing children to contribute to the state's industrial and military strength. Many students rose to incredible levels of skill, winning international competitions and advancing space exploration. Yet alongside these achievements was the pressure of conformity. School uniforms, strict discipline, and ideological lessons reminded children that their first loyalty was to the state. Even so, students whispered about banned authors, secretly passing around works by Dostoevsky or translations of Western novels. For some, reading a forbidden book was an act of intellectual survival, a way of carving out freedom inside the mind. Religion remained a quiet undercurrent. Though the state discouraged faith and sometimes punished open practice, many families held on to traditions. Easter eggs were painted in kitchens with curtains drawn. Icons stood in hidden corners, candles lit only at night. Weddings and baptisms were conducted discreetly, often with just a few trusted witnesses. These rituals gave people a sense of continuity, a reminder that survival was not only about food and clothing, but also about meaning and connection to something greater than the state. The Cold War itself loomed as both a shadow and a source of pride. Citizens watched parades of tanks and missiles in Red Square, marveling at the strength of their nation. Yet many also felt the constant anxiety of possible nuclear war. Schoolchildren practiced drills, learning to duck under desks or put on gas masks. Families quietly discussed what they would do if the sirens ever wailed for real. In the back of many minds lingered the question, would survival even be possible if the unthinkable happened? Still, people continued to live, to marry, to raise children. The fear was real, but it did not paralyze life. In small apartments, survival often hinged on cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, traded food, and looked after each other's children. When a new washing machine arrived in one household, half the building lined up to use it. When someone secured a batch of fresh apples, slices were distributed among friends. Life in these cramped spaces demanded patience, but it also created bonds of solidarity. Privacy was scarce, but community was abundant, and this network of mutual support became one of the most reliable survival strategies of all. For the younger generation, survival sometimes meant dreaming of something beyond the Soviet Union. They pinned posters of Western rock stars inside wardrobes, learned English words from smuggled dictionaries, and fantasized about Ginza, symbol of freedom as powerful as any political slogan. Jeans were more than fashion. They were identity, a statement that one could belong to a wider world. Owning a pair, even if bought illegally at outrageous prices, was an achievement as celebrated as any academic medal. Yet, for all these longings, most people did not openly rebel. Survival demanded caution. The KGB's presence, though invisible to many, was always felt. People knew that neighbors might inform, that a careless remark could lead to questioning. So they learned to wear masks, outwardly loyal, inwardly cautious. This duplicity was exhausting, but it was necessary. To speak too freely was to risk not only one's own safety, but that of family and friends. Silence, then, was not just a lack of speech. It was a deliberate act of survival. Despite the stagnation, the 1970s also carried moments of pride. The Soviet Union achieved stunning scientific feats, from space exploration to Olympic victories. Citizens watched cosmonauts soar beyond the Earth, feeling part of something monumental. Athletes draped in red and gold stood on podiums across the world, symbols of national strength. These triumphs gave people a sense of purpose, reminders that their sacrifices and struggles were tied to something larger than themselves. Survival was not only about enduring scarcity, it was about believing that endurance contributed to history at its heart. Survival in the Brezhnev era was a balancing act. People lived between scarcity and stability, between oppression and pride, between longing and endurance. They adapted with humor, creativity, and solidarity. They learned to stretch resources, to trade favors, to keep silent when silence was safest, and to laugh when laughter seemed impossible. Their story was not one of dramatic heroism, but of quiet persistence, the kind that builds not headlines, but history itself. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union appeared outwardly powerful, yet beneath the surface cracks were forming. For ordinary citizens, survival became less about dramatic political events and more about navigating the quiet, grinding struggles of daily life. Food shortages deepened, wages stagnated, and the promises of socialism seemed more distant than ever. And still, people endured. Bread remained available, but its quality often varied. Some loaves were dense and heavy, others stale within hours. Meat was more difficult to find. Families would queue at dawn, clutching ration cards and bags, hoping to purchase a few cuts. Housewives developed incredible skill at stretching meals, transforming a small piece of pork into soups that could feed a household for days. Bones were boiled for broth, skins crisped into snacks, and nothing edible went to waste. Cabbage, potatoes, and beets dominated the table, staples that were cheap and filling. A well-prepared borscht became both comfort food and a symbol of resilience. Food shortages also inspired ingenuity in urban kitchens. Women experimented with substitute ingredients, baking cakes with condensed milk or frying patties made from mashed beans when meat was unavailable. In rural areas, survival was bolstered by access to private plots. These small garden patches, officially allowed, became lifelines. Families grew cucumbers, tomatoes, carrots, and raised chickens, sometimes rabbits. On weekends, entire families worked their gardens, cultivating not just food but independence from the unreliable state supply. Produce from these plots often supplemented diets and, occasionally, was quietly traded for other goods. Beyond food, the housing crisis defined daily survival. The grand Soviet project of communal apartments, communalkas, lingered well into the 1970s. In these crowded flats, multiple families shared the same kitchen and bathroom. Privacy was nearly impossible. A mother might cook soup while another neighbor waited impatiently to boil potatoes, all while children chased each other down narrow hallways. Quarrels erupted over noise, cleanliness, and use of space, yet these homes also created unbreakable bonds. In times of hardship, neighbors supported each other like extended families, pooling food or watching each other's children. Later, prefabricated apartment blocks, the grey, offered slightly more privacy but little comfort. Thin walls carried every sound, arguments, laughter, lullabies reminding everyone that survival in the Soviet Union was a collective act. Still, many families cherished their modest two-room flats. For them, a private bathroom and a separate kitchen. No matter how small, felt like luxury compared to the overcrowded communal days. Healthcare was free in principle, but survival often meant maneuvering within an overburdened system. Clinics were crowded, medicine scarce, and doctors sometimes underpaid. Parents relied heavily on home remedies, herbal teas, mustard plasters, garlic against colds. Pharmacies were stocked unevenly, with aspirin and bandages in short supply. Yet Soviet medical workers, despite limited resources, often worked tirelessly to care for their communities. A village doctor might ride for miles in freezing conditions to reach a patient, while urban hospitals carried out surgeries with outdated equipment but remarkable skill. For citizens, survival through illness was a mix of resilience, improvisation, and sheer determination. The workplace remained central to Soviet life, not only as a source of income, but as a hub of survival. Factories provided more than wages. They sometimes distributed goods, offered holiday vouchers, or allocated housing. A job could determine a family's entire future. Workers learned the importance of loyalty, but they also navigated inefficiencies. Machines broke down, supplies vanished, managers bent rules. Many employees took on Subotnik's voluntary Saturday laborers, a way to demonstrate devotion to the collective. Yet behind the official rituals, survival often meant finding ways to do less work while still meeting quotas. People mastered the art of pretend work, ensuring that they did not stand out, neither for praise nor punishment. Corruption, though rarely spoken of aloud, was part of survival. Small bribes smoothed everyday difficulties. A box of chocolates might secure quicker medical treatment. A bottle of vodka might convince a shop assistant to save scarce items under the counter. These practices were technically illegal, but they became woven into the fabric of Soviet life. Citizens understood that connections bloat were often more valuable than rubles. Knowing the right person in a shop, a hospital, or a factory could mean the difference between scarcity and abundance. Education continued to shape survival strategies. Schools drilled children in patriotism and discipline, but also instilled a love of learning. Many families viewed education as the surest path to improvement. Parents sacrificed for their children's studies, ensuring they had proper notebooks, uniforms, and tutors if possible. University students enjoyed privileges such as stipends and access to better housing, making higher education a dream worth pursuing. Still, ideological loyalty was tested. Students were expected to join youth organizations, attend rallies, and sometimes denounce dissent. For young people, survival meant balancing ambition with caution, pursuing knowledge while navigating political expectations. Leisure and escape were equally important. Holidays at state-run resort sanatoriums by the Black Sea, or in the Caucasus Sofod Citizens' Rest, though access was often determined by workplace connections. For those unable to travel, local parks, libraries, and sports clubs provided simpler joys. Chess became a national obsession, with world champions celebrated as heroes. For ordinary people, playing chess in a park or watching matches on television offered intellectual refuge. Music and film continued to shape dreams, with citizens crowding into cinemas to see both Soviet productions and the rare glimpses of foreign films. Faith, though suppressed, persisted. Orthodox churches stood quietly open, even as the state discouraged attendance. Elderly women often formed the backbone of these congregations, whispering prayers for their family's health and survival. Pagan traditions in rural areas blended with Christian rituals. creating a hidden spiritual life that offered meaning and resilience. Though open religious devotion risked state disapproval, many found strength in faith during times when ideology felt hollow. The Cold War's pressures seeped into daily routines. Citizens heard speeches about American threats, NATO missiles, and Soviet strength. Propaganda filled newspapers, promising eventual victory of socialism over capitalism. Yet survival at the individual level was more immediate. Citizens cared less about ideological battles than about whether they could buy soap or find winter boots. Still, the global tension influenced their sense of identity. Parades of military hardware reassured them of strength, while also reminding them of the fragile peace they lived under. Children, too, learned the art of survival early. They memorized patriotic songs, joined the young pioneers, and marched in red scarves. Yet after school, they played in courtyards, swapped foreign candy wrappers as treasures, and invented games with makeshift toys. Childhood was shaped by scarcity, but also by imagination. A tin can became a football. A wooden stick became a sword. Despite hardships, laughter echoed across playgrounds, proving that even in the most constrained environments, joy could find a place. Family life anchored survival above all. In cramped apartments, 3 generations often lived together, grandparents caring for grandchildren while parents worked. Elders passed down knowledge of traditions, recipes, and quiet ways to endure. The wisdom of survival, how to save sugar, how to fix a shoe, how to avoid suspicion, was handed down like a secret inheritance. Families clung together tightly, finding warmth in each other even when material comforts were scarce. As the decade closed, disillusionment grew. Promises of abundance, spoken in speeches and printed in newspapers, rarely matched reality. Yet people rarely spoke of rebellion. Instead, they carried on with patience, humor, and practicality. Soviet jokes, sharp and witty, became another form of survival. To laugh at the absurdity of bureaucracy or shortages was to preserve sanity. A popular joke summed it up. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. In that shared humor lay both critique and resilience. Survival in the late Brezhnev years was not a story of dramatic upheaval, but of steady endurance. It was the story of millions of lives lived between scarcity and solidarity, between control and quiet defiance. While the world saw the Soviet Union as a superpower, inside its borders, ordinary people measured power differently, not in missiles or medals, but in loaves of bread, in repaired shoes, in laughter shared across a kitchen table. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Soviet Union stood at a strange crossroads. To the outside world, it looked strong and stable, its influence stretching from Eastern Europe to Asia and beyond. But for the millions of citizens within its borders, life was defined less by grand geopolitics and more by the everyday grind of endurance. Their survival was not built on dramatic resistance or sweeping revolutions, but on the small, persistent acts of adaptation that allowed them to carry on. The rhythm of daily life was set by shortages. One could never be sure what the stores might have in stock. Entering a shop, a person might find bare shelves, or perhaps a sudden delivery of oranges or sausage that would send word of mouth racing through neighborhoods. The sight of a long line outside a store became an event in itself, drawing passers-by to join, often without knowing what was being sold. Queuing was less an inconvenience and more a survival strategy, an instinct learned over decades. A child sent to stand in line for butter might wait hours, clutching money and hoping the supply would last. For many, the fear of arriving too late haunted these errands. Yet waiting together in the cold or heat, citizens shared stories, whispered jokes, and built a kind of solidarity that softened the sting of scarcity. Bartering filled in the gaps where the state failed, though officially frowned upon. Quiet exchanges happened everywhere. A neighbor might trade sugar for flour, or a bottle of homemade pickles for a service like sewing or shoe repair. Sometimes these exchanges took on larger forms, with entire networks of friends and acquaintances building a web of mutual aid. A mechanic might repair a car in exchange for rare medicines. A teacher might offer tutoring in return for fruit from a rural garden. In this way, survival rested not only on personal effort, but on the strength of one's community ties. Winter, always harsh in the Soviet Union, tested this resilience further. Central heating systems often sputtered, leaving apartments chilly despite the presence of radiators. Families bundled in layers indoors, children studying lessons while wrapped in blankets. Drafts blew through poorly sealed windows, and frost painted patterns on the glass. Yet neighbors helped each other patch leaks, stuff rags in window frames, or share hot tea late into the evening. Winter survival was not just about warmth, but about perseverance and companionship. For many, black markets became another way to endure. Known as the second economy, this shadow system provided what the official economy could not. Blue jeans, Western records, cosmetics, and even extra food were available for the right price. Buying such goods was risky. Prices were high, and informers could be anywhere, but they provided glimpses of a world beyond the Iron Curtain. To own a pair of Levi's or listen to a bootleg Beatles record was more than luxury. It was a reminder of individuality in a society that demanded conformity. Families sometimes sacrificed months of savings to obtain such treasures, not for materialism, but for the quiet dignity of choice. Culture, too, was a survival tool. Soviet citizens turned to literature, film, and music not just for entertainment, but for emotional sustenance. Libraries remained popular, with people devouring both official classics and whatever foreign works slipped through the censors. Movies were communal events, with audiences laughing, crying, and sometimes even applauding in unison. Music, whether state-approved folk songs or smuggled Western rock, filled apartments late into the night. Songs became memories stitched into survival, a way to carry on when the world outside seemed cold and unchanging. Behind closed doors, humor played its own role. Jokes about shortages, about leaders, about the absurdities of bureaucracy spread like wildfire, told in whispers at dinner tables or on factory floors. These jokes served as safety valves, ways of speaking the truth in a society where honesty could be dangerous. A citizen might not dare criticize openly, but they could tell a witty remark about endless lines or empty promises, and in the laughter of others find reassurance that they were not alone. Laughter did not solve shortages, but it lightened the burden. Children continued to learn the art of survival from their families and schools. In classrooms, they pledged loyalty to the Soviet state, memorized patriotic slogans, and studied math and science with rigor. At home, they listened to grandparents recounting older times, sometimes darker, sometimes warmer. From elders they learned practical wisdom: how to reuse scraps of fabric, how to store potatoes so they would last through the winter, how to keep one's opinions guarded in public. Childhood was shaped as much by caution as by innocence. Yet children adapted quickly, turning playgrounds of concrete into fields of imagination, inventing games that required nothing more than a ball or a piece of chalk. Faith though still officially discouraged, endured as a quiet undercurrent. Churches were rarely crowded, but they were never empty. Women in headscarves lit candles, whispered prayers, and passed on traditions that nourished families spiritually even when the state provided no comfort. Icons were hidden behind curtains or placed discreetly in kitchens, small beacons of hope in cramped apartments. For many, faith was less about grand doctrine and more about survival of the soul and inner strength to carry through when food ran short or dreams seemed distant and always. There was the sense of being watched. The KGB, though invisible, was felt everywhere. People monitored their words in public, careful never to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. A casual remark about shortages, a complaint about work, could be twisted into suspicion. For survival, silence became a kind of armor, but within the privacy of trusted circles, people spoke more freely, sharing frustrations and longings. These quiet conversations, over tea, vodka, or bread, were small acts of rebellion, moments of honesty in a society where truth was rationed as tightly as butter. For citizens of the Soviet Union, the late Cold War years were not about thriving but enduring. Survival was an accumulation of small victories. A loaf of fresh bread secured after hours in line. A child's laughter on a cold winter evening. A joke whispered in confidence. A holiday by the sea earned after years of work. The grand slogans of socialism rarely matched the reality of daily life. But people learned to live within the gap, building resilience from necessity in many ways. This resilience became their most profound achievement, the ability to adapt, to find joy in scarcity, to maintain dignity amid hardship, ensured that despite the failures of the system, life went on. The Soviet citizen was not merely a passive subject of history, but an active participant in the quiet, unrecorded struggle of human survival. By the time the 1980s unfolded, the Cold War had entered its most tense and uncertain years. On one hand, the Soviet Union projected strength through military parades in Red Square, rows of tanks rolling past the Kremlin, and missiles pointing skyward as if to declare invincibility. On the other, ordinary citizens were navigating a reality that felt more fragile than powerful. The gap between the image of a mighty superpower and the lived experience of everyday life grew wider with each passing year. And for most people, survival became a careful balance between hope and resignation. In kitchens across Moscow, Kiev, Leningrad, and countless small towns, families gathered around modest meals that rarely resembled the glossy posters of socialist abundance. Dinner might consist of thin soup stretched with potatoes, black bread with margarine, or cabbage fried in oil. Meat was a luxury, saved for weekends or special occasions. Housewives learned endless tricks to make simple ingredients taste new, blending leftovers into stews or baking them into pierogi. Creativity in the kitchen was not a hobby, but a necessity. Children grew used to scarcity, but they also learned to savor what little treats appeared as sweet orange at New Year. A slice of sausage at a birthday, a square of chocolate shared between siblings. The act of shopping became a drama in itself. Stepping into a store, one never knew what might await. Empty shelves, perhaps, or a surprise delivery of eggs or butter. When word spread that a store had received something rare, lines formed instantly, often stretching for blocks. Citizens left their homes at dawn to stand outside in the cold, stamping their feet for warmth, gossiping with neighbors, and clutching ration cards or crumpled rubles. There was no guarantee that the item would last until their turn, but hope alone was worth the wait. Some clever citizens even hired professional cures, elderly relatives or unemployed, neighbors who stood in line for hours and held a place until the family member arrived. Amid this, the culture of the second economy, the black market and informal exchanges grew into an open secret. A pair of jeans from the West, a rare book, fresh produce from a countryside farm. These things could be found if you knew whom to ask and how much to pay. An electrician might fix a refrigerator in exchange for several kilograms of sausage. A taxi driver might transport contraband goods for a little extra money. Teachers, doctors, even state officials dipped into this underground economy because it offered something the official system could not: choice. For many, it was not rebellion, but simple survival. The shadow economy bled into social life, too. Weddings, birthdays, and holidays became occasions where people pooled resources. Guests often contributed not just gifts, but food and alcohol to help the family host a proper celebration. Vodka was ubiquitous, a lubricant for both joy and sorrow, and its presence on a table symbolized generosity even when other dishes were meek. Toasts rose to health, to happiness, to the endurance of friends and family. In those moments, surrounded by laughter and song, people could forget the shortages, the frustrations, and the invisible weight of the Cold War. For children, school shaped much of their daily rhythm. Mornings began with recitations of loyalty to the state, lessons in mathematics and literature, and stories of Soviet heroes. They were taught to admire cosmonauts who soared into space and soldiers who fought bravely in the Great Patriotic War. Yet beneath the official lessons, children absorbed another kind of education at home. Parents whispered advice: trust carefully, speak cautiously, never repeat at school what you hear at the dinner table. It was a dual reality, one public, one private, that every child learned to navigate. Youth culture added another layer of survival, one often tinged with rebellion. Teenagers and young adults sought ways to carve out individuality in a world of sameness. Music was the most powerful outlet. Western rock records, though banned, circulated secretly, copied again and again onto cassette tapes that passed from hand to hand. Some young people grew their hair long, wore patched jackets, or sought out black market jeans. These small acts of defiance carried risks teachers or bosses could punish them, but they also carried pride. In a society that demanded conformity, style and music became lifelines of freedom. Meanwhile, propaganda flooded the airwaves and newspapers, reminding citizens daily of their duty and the superiority of socialism. Posters proclaimed unity, hard work, and progress. Speeches promised a brighter future, though many citizens had long ceased believing them. To survive mentally, people developed the art of They nodded politely during meetings, applauded during speeches, but in private they joked, sighed, or rolled their eyes. Humor, once again, became a shield. A whispered joke about the absurdity of empty stores or endless slogans could spark laughter that lightened even the heaviest days. Religion, though suppressed, never vanished. Elderly women still crossed themselves quietly before meals. Families still baptized babies in hidden ceremonies. Churches stood weathered but resilient, their bells tolling softly over towns despite official discouragement. Faith was not only spiritual, it was cultural, a link to ancestors, a thread of continuity in a world that often felt disjointed. For some, lighting a candle in a dark church was as vital to survival as bread on the table. Through all of this, the presence of the state remained heavy and unyielding. The KGB's reputation ensured that even casual conversations were filtered through caution. Citizens learned to trust slowly, to test friendships carefully. A careless remark could cost a job, a promotion, or worse. To endure meant mastering silence, disguising opinions, and carrying unspoken truths like a secret weight. Survival was not only physical, it was psychological, an art of masking and adapting. Yet, despite all this, moments of joy persisted. Summer vacations at the Black Sea, though simple, felt luxurious. Families boarded crowded trains, carrying suitcases full of food, and traveled south to feel the warmth of the sun on their skin. Children splashed in the waves, parents lounged on beaches, and for a few weeks, life felt lighter. In those sunlit days, survival transformed into something more, a glimpse of living rather than enduring. By the 1980s, Soviet citizens had become masters of adaptation. They built lives within the cracks of a system that promised abundance but delivered scarcity. They found laughter in shortages, music in silence, warmth in the cold, and resilience in the face of hardship. The Cold War raged on. Missiles pointed across oceans, leaders sparred in speeches. But for the people living day to day, survival meant something more personal. It meant finding strength in one another, carrying traditions forward, and holding on to the quiet hope that someday life might be easier. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War reached its twilight, though few could have predicted how quickly the world would change. For citizens of the Soviet Union, the daily rhythm of survival continued with its familiar burdens cues. Shortages, whispered conversations, and private laughter, but under the surface. The foundations of their world were beginning to crack. It was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow unraveling, felt first in small shifts in language, in cautious reforms, in the unexpected speeches of leaders who spoke of change rather than unyielding strength. Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 marked a turning point. His words, glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring began to circulate across kitchens and workplaces. For many citizens, these concepts were confusing, even frightening. Could openness really exist in a land where silence had always been survival? Could restructuring bring real improvement to the empty shelves and worn apartments? Yet hope sparked, fragile and uncertain, as newspapers began printing stories that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Suddenly, the once monolithic silence of the state began to crack, and citizens found themselves speaking, cautiously at first, about truths they had long carried in secret. Still, reform did not erase hardship. Food shortages worsened in some regions as the economy struggled to adapt. Queues grew longer, ration cards became more common, and even the simplest goods, sugar, butter, cigarettes, were rationed tightly. Mothers worried about how to feed their children, while fathers took on extra work or bartered in the second economy just to keep food on the table. In villages, families relied more heavily on small garden plots, growing potatoes and cabbage as insurance against the uncertainty of stores. These garden patches, often tended with devotion, were symbols of resilience. They represented not only food, but independence, a reminder that even in a vast state-controlled system, individual families could still carve out survival with their own hands. In the cities, adaptation took on new forms. People formed cooperative societies, pooling resources and skills. A mechanic might fix cars for extra cash, while an artist painted portraits in exchange for bread or sugar. Markets, both official and unofficial, buzzed with activity as citizens sought out what they needed by any means available. The lines between legal and illegal blurred, not in the sense of crime, but in the sense of necessity. A loaf of bread acquired through a friend of a friend did not feel like rebellion. It felt like life itself. For younger generations, the winds of change carried a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Western films and music, once hidden, began to trickle into public view. Concerts and performances hinted at a world beyond the Iron Curtain. And for the first time, many young Soviets saw glimpses of a different kind of life. Jeans, rock music, and American pop culture became symbols of freedom. And though not everyone could access them, their very existence suggested that the world was larger, more diverse, and perhaps more hopeful than official slogans had long declared at the same time. Older generations often watched these changes with unease. They had survived wars, purges, and decades of rigid control. And now they saw traditions shifting, values questioned, and once untouchable institutions criticized openly. For them, survival had always meant caution and obedience, and the new openness felt both liberating and dangerous. In many households, this created quiet generational tension. Grandparents urging silence, parents uncertain, children eager to speak freely. Yet despite differences, families remained bound together by the same hardships, waiting in lines, sharing meals, and holding on to one another when the world outside felt unstable. Religion, once suppressed, experienced a revival in this period. Churches reopened, icons reappeared in homes, and faith resurfaced as a source of comfort. For many, returning to prayer was less about politics and more about a search for stability in a world that seemed to be changing overnight. Lighting candles in a cathedral or hearing the chime of church bells offered a reminder of continuity, a thread connecting the uncertain present to a deeper past. Amid these shifts, humor remained as essential as ever. Political cartoons began appearing in newspapers. Jokes about leaders spread more openly, and satire once whispered in kitchens found its way onto theater stages. Citizens laughed, not because their hardships had vanished, but because laughter was still the strongest medicine against despair. A single clever joke could make hours of waiting in a food line more bearable. And shared laughter reminded people that even in struggle, they were not alone. By the late 1980s, survival had become a more complex equation. It was no longer only about food or shelter. It was about navigating uncertainty, embracing new freedoms while clinging to old safety, and trying to prepare for a future that no one could predict. The Cold War might still loom large in speeches and international posturing, but in the lives of ordinary citizens, the war they fought daily was quieter. It was the war against scarcity, the war against silence, the war for dignity in a system that had long demanded conformity. Yet, within the uncertainty, resilience shone brightly. Families still gathered around modest tables, sharing bread and stories. Neighbors still helped one another in times of need. Children still played, dreamed, and laughed in courtyards, even as their parents worried about what tomorrow might bring. In these simple acts of endurance, Soviet citizens revealed the true strength of survival. They had not only endured the hardships of decades past, but were now stepping into a future that promised both risk and possibility. The Cold War had shaped every part of their lives, what they ate, how they spoke, how they thought, but it had not broken their spirit. The ability to adapt, to endure, and to find joy in small victories remained their greatest weapon. And as the Soviet Union stood on the edge of its final years, that spirit of resilience would carry its people forward into an unknown future. One that promised change, but not without cost. By the final years of the 1980s, the facade of strength that had defined the Soviet Union for so long was beginning to collapse under its own weight. To the outside world, the USSR still projected the image of a mighty superpower, locked in a tense rivalry with the West, boasting nuclear arsenals and military parades. But to the citizens who lived in its villages, towns, and cities, the image had already begun to crumble. Survival in those years was not about rockets or speeches. It was about food, warmth, dignity, and hope. The shortages that had always haunted Soviet life grew worse as the economy faltered. Even simple items, once taken for granted, became luxuries. Soap, sugar, and flour were rationed, forcing families to strategize how to stretch each item as far as possible. Mothers learned to create meals from scraps, turning a few potatoes, a piece of cabbage, and a dash of oil into soups that could feed a family for days. Children learned not to complain about the monotony of food because everyone understood that monotony was better than hunger. Lines, which had long been a fact of life, became endless, winding around blocks and lasting for hours. Citizens carried bags with them at all times, ready to queue at a moment's notice if rumors spread that butter or sausage had arrived at a local shop. In villages, the garden plot became more than a supplement, it was a lifeline. Families poured their labor into growing enough potatoes to last through the winter, filling basements and cellars with sacks of food that might mean the difference between survival and hunger. Chickens, goats, and pigs were raised in backyards, often without official permission but tolerated because they filled a gap the state could not. For children, memories of their childhood in the late Soviet years are often filled with the smell of earth, the ache of bending over rows of crops, and the satisfaction of harvesting food with their families. Heating was another struggle. Winters in the Soviet Union were long and brutal, with snow and freezing winds dominating much of the country. State-provided heating often failed or worked only intermittently. Families bundled together in single rooms, wrapping themselves in heavy blankets, heating stoves with wood or coal if they could find it. Villagers cut down trees for fuel, while city dwellers sometimes bartered or bribed to keep their radiators alive. In these winters, endurance was measured in layers of clothing, the ability to ignore the sting of frost inside one's own home, and the shared warmth of family members huddled close, while hardship deepened. Something else emerged in awareness that the system was unraveling. For decades, silence had been a form of survival. Citizens had learned not to question authority openly, not to speak too loudly about shortages or unfairness. But in the era of glasnost, suddenly, newspapers and television began acknowledging the struggles that everyone already knew too well. The truth was no longer hidden, and this paradoxically gave citizens both hope and fear. Hope that change might finally come. Fear that exposing the truth would bring instability they had never known before. Young people, especially, were restless. Rock concerts, underground clubs, and unofficial gatherings spread across cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kyiv. Jeans, cassette tapes, and Western culture became prized possessions, symbols of a world beyond Soviet borders. These items were not just fashion or music, they were statements of identity, of wanting something freer, something more alive than the rigid system they had inherited. Parents often worried about the risks of this openness, but many quietly admired their children's courage. For them, silence had been survival. For the youth, expression had become a form of rebellion. Religion, too, regained ground. Cathedrals and churches, once shuttered or controlled, reopened their doors. Icons appeared once again in kitchens and bedrooms where they had long been hidden. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals carried not only religious meaning but also cultural defiance, a declaration that faith could not be erased by decree. For many, returning to the church was less about politics than about finding something solid to hold on to in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Yet even amid this instability, ordinary people found ways to keep life moving. Weddings were still celebrated, though often with meager banquets of bread, pickles, and vodka. Birthdays were marked with laughter, songs, and the clinking of glasses, even if the gifts were simple or homemade. Neighbors still gathered in courtyards to share news, watch children play, and swap stories of survival. The resilience of these everyday rituals cannot be overstated. They were reminders that even as the state weakened, community remained strong. Humor reached new heights in those final years. Jokes about leaders and shortages circulated widely, sometimes even appearing in official publications. What once could have been grounds for punishment now became a shared release. A line for bread might be dull and exhausting, but one clever joke told to those waiting could spread laughter down the block. Comedy shows on television poked fun at bureaucracy, resonating deeply with citizens who had spent their entire lives tangled in paperwork and inefficiency. For many, humor was not just an escape, but a weapon, a way to puncture the absurdity of their circumstances. As the 1980s drew to a close, survival in the Soviet Union was no longer just about food or warmth. It was about navigating a crumbling reality. The system that had once seemed immovable now trembled before their eyes, and people did what they had always done: they adapted. They held on to their families, to their gardens, to their jokes, and to their faith. They endured the uncertainty of not knowing what tomorrow might bring, because they had already survived decades of hardship. And yet, there was something different in the air. An unspoken recognition that the world they knew was coming to an end. The Cold War may have defined global politics, but for Soviet citizens, the real battle was fought in kitchens, in queues, in cold apartments, and in the quiet determination to keep living. Their survival was not glamorous, not marked by speeches or slogans, but by resilience, by the simple refusal to give up, even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. By 1990, the Soviet Union was unraveling faster than most of its citizens could comprehend. For years, they had been told that the system was strong, eternal, and destined to outlast its Western rivals. But the cracks, once hidden beneath layers of propaganda, had split wide open. Shops were emptier than ever. Shelves stood bare, with only jars of pickles or cans of sprats left untouched. Citizens joked grimly that if you saw a line, it didn't matter what was at the end. You joined it because something, anything, was better than nothing. Money itself had begun to lose meaning. Rubles piled up in wallets and purses, but there was often nothing to spend them on. Inflation gnawed at savings, and prices for certain goods soared when state controls weakened. Bartering returned as an everyday survival tactic. In rural villages, people traded eggs for flour, potatoes for firewood, labor for meat. In cities, cigarettes became a form of currency, used to smooth transactions or secure small favors. A carton of Marlboros, smuggled from abroad, could be worth more than a month's salary. Citizens adapted in ingenious ways. Some dug deep into family traditions of preservation, filling pantries with jars of pickled cucumbers, cabbage, and berries to ensure they had food through the winter. Others turned to black markets, despite the risks, because survival often required bending rules that no longer seemed to protect anyone. On sidewalks, underground markets buzzed with quiet trade, selling everything from jeans to sausage, from Western chocolates to aspirin. Authorities tried to suppress them, but the demand was too great and the need too real. Children grew up fast in this environment. They learned to read the subtle expressions of adults standing in line to tell whether the rumors of food arriving were true or false. They memorized the streets where small kiosks might sell a little extra, and they carried bags home with pride when they managed to return with sugar or flour. Yet childhood was not lost entirely. Even in the hardest years, children played soccer in courtyards, sledded down snowy hills, and traded candy wrappers like treasure. Hardship did not erase joy, only reshaped it. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a single moment, but a slow, grinding unraveling. Factories stopped paying workers on time. Transport became unreliable, leaving people stranded or forcing them to walk long distances. Power cuts became frequent, plunging neighborhoods into cold and darkness. Yet amid this chaos, people clung to whatever they could to keep life moving. Weddings still happened, though brides often wore borrowed dresses and banquets consisted of potatoes and vodka. Funerals, somber and quiet, brought families together in grief but also in solidarity. Faith in the future was tested daily. Some believed that the end of the Soviet Union might finally bring relief, that new opportunities would emerge once the old system was gone. Others feared that chaos would swallow them whole. Elderly citizens who had survived wars, famines, and Stalinist terror looked on with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. They had been told they had sacrificed everything to build a state that would endure, and now they watched as it crumbled into fragments. Television, once a rigid mouthpiece of the state, became a window into a confusing world. Citizens saw leaders argue, republics declare independence, walls fall in Berlin, and new ideas sweep across Europe. To many, it was overwhelming. For decades, their world had been hard, but simple. Now it seemed complicated, unstable, and unpredictable. And yet, even in the final collapse, the spirit of survival never faded. Families gathered in kitchens with dim lights and weak tea, sharing stories of what they had endured, making plans for what might come next. Neighbors pooled resources, watching each other's children, lending tools, or splitting firewood. Humor still persisted. People laughed at absurdities such as queuing for hours, only to discover that the store was selling nothing but mustard or vinegar. Laughter was not denial. It was resistance, proof that despair had not conquered them. By December 1991, when the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, many citizens were too exhausted to celebrate or mourn. They were simply focused on the same things they had always been: finding food, keeping warm, protecting their families. The collapse was historic, but survival was personal. The red flag came down, a new era began, and yet the needs of everyday life remained as relentless as ever. The story of Soviet citizens during the Cold War is not just about geopolitics or ideology. It is about endurance. For decades, they lived in a world where fear, scarcity, and uncertainty shaped every decision, and yet they endured. They learned to adapt, to joke, to share, to hold on to small rituals of normal life, even when the larger world seemed to crumble around them. As the Soviet Union ended, Many were left with a mix of relief, sorrow, and uncertainty, but their survival had proven something undeniable, that resilience is not forged in comfort but in hardship. It is not about grand victories, but about the quiet strength to wake up each day, face the cold, stand in line, and hope that tomorrow will bring something better.